Hello, and thank you for joining us for another episode of Jackman Radio. I'm your host, Mike Jackman, and today I'm very excited to be joined by a researcher, author, professor, and film historian, um, Mr. Joseph McBride. How are you today, Mr. McBride?
Doing great. Good to be with you, Mike. I appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to read a little blurb here from the Amazon page about your new book, just to give our viewers an idea. In 1963, President John F. Kennedy was killed in a coup d'etat. Ever since then, it has been virtually taboo in American mainstream media to report this basic truth. Print and television news reporters and historians spread the government's lies and attack people they label conspiracy theorists rather than investigating the case themselves. Joseph McBride, author of Into the Nightmare, My Search for the Killers of President John F. Kennedy and Officer J.D. Tippit, offers a deep analysis of this dereliction of journalistic duty. Political Truth, the Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy, which is Joseph's recent book from last December, I believe, assimilates a wealth of media disinformation and contrastingly accurate investigations by independent researchers, reporters, and filmmakers. McBride's provocative study traces how the false reporting of the assassination has led to today's poisonous political divide over the meaning of historical reality. So, quite a bit to unpack there, but I have not read that book yet, but I wanted to promote that briefly. And I did read Into the Nightmare, which actually took me many months to read. And so you spent 34 years working on that book. Is that accurate?
Yeah. Well, I began my what I call in-depth, serious research on the case in 1982, and the book came out Into the Nightmare in 2013. So it took 31 years, and along the way, I was thinking of doing a chapter on the media on how they distort the facts about the assassination. And I kept thinking, it's too big a topic, for one chapter. It deserves a whole book. So I did some work on it in the 90s and put it aside. And I went back to it in the last couple of years. Wrote Political Truth, the Media, and the Assassination of President Kennedy. I did have a chapter Into the Nightmare on what I call the 4-day television docudrama that weekend. Which I'm a critic of the media and a film scholar, so I've worked in television and films as a screenwriter, so I'm very keenly interested in the role of the media in spreading propaganda. And that weekend, first you have this shocking development: president murdered, Officer Tippit murdered. Then the suspect is brought in, paraded before the cameras, and basically tried on television. This was an eye-opener to me as a 16-year-old kid, because I always thought we had due process and you're innocent until proven guilty, and this showed me that the media try and convict people on television. And then you have the execution live on TV, and then you have the alleged closure, the third act, if you will, on Sunday night. Henry Wade, the DA, reading all the charges against him, a lot of which were just wrong. And then on Monday, you have the funeral, which is this grand spectacle that was very moving, but it had the effect of kind of tranquilizing the country. And in some countries, if the leader is killed, people go out on the streets and they demand answers, and then they may overthrow the new government, and all kinds of things happen. But it didn't happen here because TV made people stay at home. 93% of the sets were being used that day, which was a record. And it was a form of tranquilization. And then I was always really bothered by something Dan Rather said. He was one of the reporters who made his career on the assassination, and very suspect figure, in my opinion. He said the day that he always thinks about is the Tuesday, November 26th, when America went back to work and basically life resumed its normal functions. And I, on the contrary, remember that day vividly as extraordinarily bleak. I went back to school, and I felt kind of unmoored. I'd worked for Kennedy in his 1960 Wisconsin presidential primary campaign, and he had influenced me. I wanted to go into politics, and that that idea was shattered when my candidate was murdered and the government didn't solve the crime. And so that was not a happy day, and it did not mean that everything is back to normal. It was the opposite. But I've actually been studying the assassination from way back. As I say, I worked for him in 1960, and I got to meet him twice during the campaign, very close up. Met him once when he was president. And I was struck by his lack of security at these two events in Wisconsin. One was 2 blocks from our house. They held a rally. My mother was a prominent figure in the Wisconsin Democratic Party, Marion Dunn McBride, and she set up a Kids for Kennedy rally. He came to the Wauwatosa City Hall, and it was a small noonday crowd with mothers and kids, and it was so small that we got to mingle with him and chat with him, and it was really wonderful. But I noticed he came in with, I think it was 2 people. One was a reporter. It could have been Theodore White, who wrote The Making of the President, because not too many reporters were trailing, and it's not like today. And one aide, and that was it. And he was, standing around and we were talking to him. One of my little brothers kept crawling under his legs and coming back through his legs to shake his hand again.
Wow.
He was very approachable. And then I met him, and 4 days later, April 3rd, 1960, the big rally in the campaign. There's a classic documentary called Primary, which I recommend to people. That's the centerpiece of the documentary, this big rally with 3,000 people in Milwaukee. And I got to stand in line and talk to him, get his autograph. And he had no visible security, except if you look at the film, there's a policeman standing nearby, and that's about it. But he was very exposed to the public, and I think I was concerned about that because I was a history buff, I guess you call it, as a kid, and I read Huey Bauman's book, Secret Service Chief. He was the previous Secret Service Chief, describing in detail the threats and dangers to the president, how they tried to control them, and he had kind of warnings of repression that were not followed in Dallas, security measures. So I wrote a short story about Kennedy's assassination in October 1961 for my high school English class in Milwaukee, and it was called The Plot Against the Country. And it's really juvenilia, but I stole the plot from the Superman comic about how he was killed licking a stamp that had poison under it. They tried that with Superman with kryptonite, but the parts that I got right, where I realized it would be a plot, and it requires a lot of doing. They killed him in this story in his office, but I also wrote about the autopsy and questions surrounding how did they do it, etc. So in some ways I was kind of alert to what might happen.
Yeah,
And
that's eerie.
2 years before the assassination, I was concerned about it. So when it happened, I was not completely surprised. I was in the cafeteria line at Marquette University High School, and the guy at the counter said, "Did you hear Kennedy was shot?" And I laughed, reflexively, because I thought he was kidding. And then I realized he wasn't kidding. So I spun around and ran out the door. Only kid at the school to do that. I ran 2 blocks to a pharmacy where there was a radio playing that I knew was always on. And I stood there with a small group of people listening to the news from 12:40 onward. The assassination happened at 12:30 Central Time. And, I listened as the first reports came in, and they said, the radio reports from the network said that he was shot from the front, from either the railroad bridge or the hill in front of him, which we now call the grassy knoll, as it was dubbed later in the day. And then this is from 12:40 to 1 o'clock. And at 1 o'clock, they started saying the shots all came from behind, from this building called the Texas School Book Depository. And I was already a journalist. I sold my first article in 1960, and I was the editor of my school news magazine, and my parents were journalists. So I smelled a rat right away, because when they change a story like that without explanation, something is wrong. If they had given a credible explanation of why they were wrong about the shots from the front, and they didn't do that. They just said shots all came from behind. So they changed the direction of the shots. And so by the end of the day, I was not believing the official case, I watched the live coverage of Oswald being hauled back and forth in the police station, and I saw him say live on TV, "I'm just a patsy" at 7:55 p.m. and I began believing him, and they weren't giving us much in the way to go on in terms of evidence. And when he had his midnight press conference, I really thought, well, this guy's not guilty. It was, he said, he actually said, I don't know. Somebody said, you're charged with killing the president. He said he was surprised. I've not been told that, but a reporter in the hall asked me that question. And I talked to Jim LaBelle, the detective who was in charge of the Tippit case, and he was involved in interrogating Oswald. And he said Oswald was telling the truth. They hadn't charged him yet with the murder of the president, only
Wow.
with the murder of the policeman. And LaValle and DA Henry Wade, who I also interviewed for Into the Nightmare, indicated to me that, as LaValle said, Captain Will Fritz, the head of homicide, told him, let's wrap it up, get him for the Tippit murder because we don't really have evidence for, enough evidence on the presidential shooting. So it's no coincidence he was charged first with the Tippit murder. And I found an FBI document that people had overlooked that said he was never even arraigned for murdering the president, only for killing Tippit. They did charge him with the assassination in the wee hours of the morning, but they really didn't have any evidence. Oswald told his brother Robert when he came to see him at the jail, he said, don't believe all this so-called evidence, which I think is a key comment. And so they were trying to find anything they could, but the Tippit case was ignored for a long time. The Warren Commission barely was interested in it. And there was a fellow named Gary Muir who published a short, but he actually didn't publish it. It was an unpublished short monograph in 1971 about the murder of Tippit. It's quite good in its analysis. You can find it online, but he never got it published. And that was about it for the Tippit murder. And so I thought, here's a case that obviously is related in some way, but it hasn't been studied carefully. And people just sort of assume Oswald did it. And it's sort of backward logic that they kind of sold the idea that here's a guy who killed a cop fleeing from justice, and that proves that he killed President Kennedy. Well, it doesn't prove that he killed the president, even if he killed the cop, which I don't think he did. It could have been unrelated, or it could have been, a different scenario. And but that helped convince people that he's a desperate cop killer. And anyway, I went into that. We could talk more about that. And so Ken Jones Jr. was kind of my mentor. He was a feisty, independent newspaper editor and publisher in Midlothian, Texas, which is about 20 miles from Dallas. He had his own printing press. Somebody once said, you don't have freedom of the press in America unless you own the printing press. And Ken owned a little printing press. He took me to his office and had a few employees, and they put out this little paper, and he had a column, and he broke a lot of the leads in the Kennedy case. He said, I didn't believe it was a conspiracy until Sunday night. That's how naive I was. He said, but he kept up this drumbeat. And he was, to me, is the epitome of, what we want out of journalism. A small town editor who's got integrity and is indefatigable. And he told me, and he told other researchers, he said, find some area of the case that's been neglected and research the hell out of it. And so I thought, well, the Tippit case, that's been neglected. I'll research the hell out of it, which I did. It took a long time, but I think I advanced our knowledge of what happened with Tippit. We could talk about that too.
Yeah, I mean, it is kind of confusing, I think, for a lot of people because of the timelines and because of, the eyewitness reports, like Aquila Clemens saying that essentially she saw a more of a built, stocky person and maybe two men fleeing from the scene. And she was on her porch, I think, one of the closest witnesses, other than the guy who was, I think, in his truck right on the street. And but I wanted to focus on that today because I do think it's important. some would call it a tertiary aspect of the assassination, but I really think a lot of the truth and a lot of the real details are in the smaller secondary areas of the assassination. Like, for example, I read recently that the fellow that drove Oswald to the depository, Buell Frazier, when he had Oswald at his house to go to the depository that day, his mother was looking at him and Oswald from her kitchen, and she didn't see any parcel or gun or anything that could have been construed as a gun. And neither did his sister. So if Oswald didn't bring the gun to the depository that day, how did a gun get there? And of course, there's all kinds of inconsistencies with what kind of gun it was and how it got there. And then you have an FBI man kind of going around Dallas, early on, and they talk to one of the supervisors who worked at the depository when Oswald shows up with Frazier, and he doesn't see any kind of package or anything big enough to be a gun. So that little detail alone just kind of blows a lot of the official story out of the water. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Many problems with the alleged gun. First of all, they reported it was a Mauser. And there was a deputy sheriff who actually had run a sporting goods store, was an expert on guns. He identified it as a Mauser, as well as another detective. And Henry Wade, the DA, called it a Mauser. And actually, there were several guns floating around the depository. You can see in news footage, the guns look different from the Mannlicher Carcano that they claim to have found. And there was also a Mauser brought to the depository on November 20th by a man named Warren Castor, who worked for the Texas School Book Depository. And he bought this gun as a present for somebody, and he was showing it to the employees on November 20th, which is odd. And but John Armstrong wrote a very good book called Harvey and Lee, which is about two Oswalds. And if some of this stuff had been known on the day of the shooting or the day after, it would have been really hard for us to understand that there were two guys using the identity of Oswald. And I was kind of agnostic on that for a long time. And Armstrong proved it to me, because from early on, people thought, well, wait a second, he's reported to be in two places at the same time. Credible witnesses said he was here and then he was in a different city. And there are many such reports. And a guy named Richard Popkin wrote a book early on called The Second Oswald. He didn't have all the resources that Armstrong devoted. Armstrong was is a wealthy real estate guy, and he had the means to spend 10 years researching the case. This guy really did amazingly exhaustive research. And basically, he has a chapter on the gun and a chapter on the revolver that Oswald allegedly used to shoot Tippit. He basically proved that there's no evidence that Oswald ever owned those two weapons. Many anomalies in the records of guns being tracked. And so the Mannlicher Carcano was obviously a plant. Also, it's a terrible weapon, cheap Italian war surplus weapon. It was called the humanitarian rifle by Italian soldiers because it never killed anybody. And it was misaligned. The sight was misaligned. It was jammed. It was hard to operate, etc. Oswald was not a great marksman. He had kind of average scores in the Marines, but also nobody's been able to place him in the 6-4 window. And they admitted that during that weekend. Chief Curry of the Dallas Police Department said, if we can put the gun in his hands, we can build the case, which is an interesting way to phrase it, put the gun in his hands. And there is a report from the mortician in Fort Worth who handled the body for burial. He said that when Oswald was in the mortuary there at the cemetery, two FBI guys came in and told him to leave, and they went in the mortuary for a while, and they came out, and Oswald's hands were full of ink. He had to wash ink off his hands. They allegedly were getting fingerprints, but it is thought that they may have brought the Mannlicher Carcano there to put his prints on the rifle, as Curry said. So there are a lot of there's so much manufactured evidence in this case. One of the things is it's good training for a researcher is to really keep an open mind about every single piece of so-called evidence, because you can't take anything at face value. That's a big mistake if you do that, because there are so many problems with the physical evidence and eyewitness evidence. In some cases, it's contradictory, etc. And you have to really study it from every angle. I did a biography of Frank Capra, the great movie director, and spent 7 years on that. And he had lied thoroughly in his autobiography, except he reported his date of birth correctly and the date the ship left Naples for the United States. Those two things checked out. Nothing else was true. So it was good training for me. I reinvented the wheel of Capra scholarship because I realized I had to, prove it all. And there's a long paper trail on all of us. I discovered that this is long before the internet. We leave a trail of records and documents and things, and I dotted every I and crossed every T in that case, and found out almost everything there was to know about him. And it's good discipline, and I followed that in the Kennedy case, the Tippit case. They're extraordinarily complex, and the record was muddied on purpose by the authorities to cause confusion. There's a fellow, Vincent Salandria, who died recently, was an early researcher, and he thought we had been systematically misled into studying the micro evidence and not the big picture. We were distracted by all the confusing evidence. And I kind of half agree, because obviously micro evidence is really important, because that's how you prove a case. But you can get lost in that and not look at the bigger picture. How is this pulled off and who did it? And I mean, one discovery I made, I'm not the first one who said that Oswald may have been an FBI informant, which I believe, but I turned up some information that he may have met with the FBI 3 times that November before the assassination. And it is known that he went to the Dallas FBI office around November 12th to deliver some kind of letter, printed message. They claimed the message said, "If you don't stop harassing my wife, I'm going to blow up the FBI office." But that message was destroyed by the FBI shortly after Oswald was killed, so we don't really know what it said.
Was that to Hosty, Agent Hosty?
Agent Hosty was the recipient of it, and Gordon Shanklin, the head of the office, said, "Take this and destroy it." So he flushed it down a toilet. But the Dallas Morning News, the day Oswald was shot, in the paper, which went out obviously before Oswald was shot, it said he had met with the FBI on November 16th as well. And then Henry Wade, who's a former FBI man, told me that he said Oswald met with the FBI a day or two before the assassination. So that's, if that's all correct, that's 3 meetings. So I think he was an FBI informant who was infiltrating the plot against Kennedy, and he didn't realize he was being set up as the patsy. And he had also worked clearly for the CIA when he had this alleged defection to Russia, and he was a false defector. They had a false defector program to go over there and try to spy on what the Soviets were doing, and the Soviets were onto it, and they were very suspicious. But that was a CIA operation. He was a Marine veteran, and he may have been working for Office of Naval Intelligence as well. And the CIA created what's called a legend around him, all kinds of, stories that later could be used to incriminate somebody. And Armstrong and other people have gone into great detail in that too, like his alleged trip to Mexico City, which I don't think happened. But with suspicious haste, on the day Kennedy was killed, they released to the press all kinds of incriminating information on Oswald through compliant reporters. And that's part of the story of Political Truth, the book I wrote recently about how the media are so corrupt, the mainstream media, that they're in bed with the CIA. Carl Bernstein of Woodward Bernstein fame wrote a terrific piece in Rolling Stone in 1977, and you can read it on his website. It's about the CIA's infiltration of the media. And he wrote that there were about 400 members of the media at that time working for the CIA, either CIA people undercover or reporters who were helping the CIA and doing their bidding, and it's very pervasive, and it still goes on. And they've infiltrated the media, and so that day there was a CIA-connected journalist in Florida called Hal Hendricks, who leaked all kinds of this information to the press. By the end of the day, we supposedly knew a lot about Oswald's alleged communist leanings, and I don't think he was a genuine communist. I think he masqueraded as one, but they set him up as a crazy communist, defector, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very complex case, and that's why it took me 31 years to write that book. And I was researching I started basically, when he was shot, I started reading the material, and I was skeptical. But when the Warren Report came out in '64, like a lot of people, I was sort of convinced. I thought, okay, well, they must have wrapped it up. And then dissenting books began coming out in '66, and I was reading about it. And by the end of '66, I wrote a letter to the local newspaper in Madison, Wisconsin, where I was a student, and I said, I don't know what to believe in this case anymore. My faith in the system was pretty well shattered by that time. And but I didn't seriously begin researching it until the '70s. Watergate helped spur me to do it, because here's a bona fide conspiracy. Everybody knows there's a conspiracy of some kind, although I think the whole truth about that didn't come out at the time either. But it revealed, and then the church committee revealed a lot of things about foreign leaders who we were helping to assassinate. And all this came out, and I began thinking of the Kennedy assassination again in a new light, and I started reading the books. But it wasn't until '82 that I really decided to go ahead, full bore. And I've been researching it every day since then. I read all the new books, and many documents have come out, millions of pages. I used to have to go to the National Archives in Washington to read in Xerox documents before a lot of them were put online. But the JFK Records Act, which was passed in the wake of Oliver Stone's film JFK, at the end of the film it said, why are all these many records still classified in this crime? If a lone nut killed Kennedy with no accountability,
right,
why keep all these documents secret? And so Congress was shamed into passing a law that President George H.W. Bush reluctantly signed into law, and created the Assassination Records Review Board. And they've released millions of pages of documents, and they put them online, although it's kind of a hodgepodge. It's hard to track them. But there are still something like 15,000 documents classified. And next month, December, President Biden has to make another decision about whether to release these things. And the law has been violated because the law said within 25 years, everything needs to be released, with a few exceptions, like sources and methods being disclosed. Although, if they disclose sources and methods that existed in '63, such as surveillance cameras outside the Cuban embassy in Mexico City, that's not really going to jeopardize anything today. But
right.
Also the names of agents and people like that could be withheld because some people have their lives in jeopardy. There are very few exceptions like that, and tax records are still secret. Oswald's tax records.
Yeah, I find that to be very strange. And was her name Ann Goodpaster, who worked for the CIA, who handled their payroll, and remembers seeing him or handling payment for him or something? I forget what the specific information is on that, but
recently there was a woman who was researching, Betsy Wolfe of the House Select Committee on Assassinations, did some research, and she found out that while he was still in the Marine Corps, for one whole quarter he wasn't paid by the Marine Corps, which suggests he was getting paid by somebody else. So we really don't know his sources of income. He had rather meager income, but intelligence agencies were involved with him and tracking him, and they had agents signed to him, etc. And but tax records are confidential unless the president, I believe, declassifies them for a good reason. So we don't really know that. But most of the documents that are still classified are CIA documents. And President Trump, a couple of years ago, said he was going to release all the documents. And then a day before, the CIA and the FBI got to him and persuaded him, wonder how they persuaded him not to release most of the documents, which violated that law. Although the agencies in the law can object to things, and then it's sent to the president for a final decision. But he kicked the can down the road to Biden, who released some documents, but he withheld others, and he kicked the can further down the road, which is really stretching the intent of the law. But next month he has to make a decision. But it really, anybody who thinks Oswald was a lone operator and not shot Kennedy for whatever reason, the Warren Commission could never really come up with a motive. They should be seriously asking themselves, how come all these records are secret if it was just some crazy guy doing it on his own? It shows that the government is hiding things. And many things have come out in recent years. So, the research community is very active in pursuing leads, and we have to keep an open mind about, revising our theories if new evidence comes up.
Yeah, oh, for sure. Yeah, because things can change with in light of new information coming out and other documents. I think there's an entire report on George Joannides. I think the whole thing is blacked out. I'm interested in seeing that one come out and his time in Florida and operating that station and being involved with those Cuban and anti-Cuban groups. I mean, I think that's an interesting piece of the puzzle. But getting back to the Tippit angle. So Oswald is an APB goes out for a description that roughly matches his not long after the shooting, right? And the official story says, he went back to his boarding house, got his gun, put on a different jacket, is walking down the street, and then is approached or allegedly Tippit sees him and it matches the description, and then that's why he shot him. Although some witnesses said, it looked like they were having a friendly discussion. So what's kind of the official version of that? And then what are some of the things you discovered that were just huge anomalies and really kind of give credence to that not really being what happened?
Yeah, the official story is full of preposterous things. He left downtown soon after the shooting and allegedly got on a bus, and then he tried to get a cab, and then an old lady said she wanted the cab, and he graciously let her have the cab, which is kind of odd behavior.
Just after shooting the president, here, you take the cab. I'm good. I got time.
Yeah, and then he got in a bus. The bus got stalled in traffic, and he got out. But anyway, he found a cab and made his way to Oak Cliff, which is, there's a viaduct that takes you right from downtown. If you're in Oak Cliff, you can see the downtown area at the end of the viaduct. And he goes to his rooming house, which is near the end of the viaduct. And his housekeeper said he was in his room for about 5 minutes. And they claim he went there to get a gun and change clothing. And he came out, and this was around 1 o'clock. And she said she saw him standing at the corner for a few minutes as if waiting for somebody, and then he left. And the Warren Commission claimed Tippit was shot around 1:15, which would have given Oswald time to walk 9/10 of a mile to the Tippit murder scene. But if he, first of all, the shooting time was not 1:15. You can establish that various ways. I interviewed T.F. Boley, who arrived at the scene, and he looked at his watch. It was 1:10, and he was driving past, and he stopped, and he saw some commotion around a police car, and he saw the officer lying on the street. And he walked over and tried to help, and it was 1:10. And then there was a woman, Helen Markham, who was the main witness for the Warren Commission, who was very confused and very frightened, and one of the Warren staffers called her an utter screwball, but she said it happened in 1:06. And the interesting thing about her, she was walking from her residence to the bus three blocks away to Jefferson Boulevard, which is the main drag there. Tippit was shot on Parallel Street, 10th Street. But she had to catch her bus at 1:12 to get downtown to work as a waitress. And if you have a job, you don't want to miss the bus. So she would leave home around 1:06 to walk to the bus stop. And she claimed she saw the shooting. And but Tippit, his last phone call to the police was at 1:08, and they didn't answer. There were a lot of traffic on the radio, and they tried to rouse him at 1:09, and he didn't answer. So the best estimate of when he was shot was 1:08 or 1:09. And if Oswald was standing outside his rooming house at 1:03 or 1:04, it doesn't give him time to get to the scene. I've walked that route numerous times. It takes about 8 or 10 minutes to walk there at a fast clip. If you're running, maybe you could make it a little faster, but nobody saw him walking or running. And there were a number of things that happened during that period. Tippit was behaving strangely. He was out of his district, and he was seen at 12:45, 15 minutes after the assassination, sitting in his squad car at a gas station overlooking the viaduct. And he was obviously watching for vehicles coming from downtown. And 5 people saw him there who recognized him. And then a bus went by, and there was no Oswald on the bus, and there were no cab came by, at that particular time. So Tippit took off at a high rate of speed and then went to some other location. He was driving around Oak Cliff rather frantically, and he pulled over a car on 10th Street of a fellow named Andrews who was driving a car, and Tippit pulled his squad car in front of this guy and ran over and opened the back door and looked in the back seat, and there was nobody there. And so he went back in his car and didn't say anything, but the man saw the name Tippit on his chest, and he was looking for somebody in the back seat. And also in that time period, Tippit ran into a record store on Jefferson Boulevard, a few blocks from where he would be shot. And he was known to the people in that record store. He would come in and buy country western records and things. And there was a telephone there, and it's still there. And he came in and grabbed the phone, and there were witnesses who knew him and saw him. And he dialed some number and didn't say anything. And it's not clear if he didn't get party on the phone or whether he was frustrated. So he slammed on the phone. He ran out the door, and they saw him driving back toward 10th Street, and that's the last sighting of him before he was shot. But what I found out that was particularly valuable and that advanced the case, there was a strange message on the police radio about 12:45 calling Tippit and another officer saying, "You will be at large for any emergency that comes in," which is kind of a Sylvia Marr, who wrote the best book on the case, Accessories After the Fact. She said that's kind of a generic response to any police officer in a crisis. You'll be at large for any emergency. Why did they single him out? It was some kind of coded message. And it turned out, well, I interviewed Tippit's father, Edgar Lee Tippit, who was 90 years old, very lively, very spry. He was working as a farmer in East Texas. I drove all the way out there to see him, and nice old man, very lucid, sharp, and had a long interview with him. And he said a number of things that were interesting. He said, for one thing, his son was a tremendous shot, he told me. He said they would go out hunting for food, and he said one time JD saw a bird up in a tree, 100 yards away, and he fired his rifle and shot the bird down. He was just a great shot. That contradicts the police records. There are very few records of Tippit's shooting prowess, which is odd because if you're a policeman, you have to periodically have your shooting checked. And the records indicate he was a mediocre shot, but here his father is saying he's a great shot. But anyway, the father also said that shortly after the assassination, he spoke to Marie Tippit, the officer's widow, and she said an officer came to her house to explain what happened to her husband. And this officer, who I later identified as William Menzel, who was the guy assigned to the district in which Tippit was shot, said that he and Tippit were ordered to search for Oswald in Oak Cliff soon after the assassination. And he didn't say what they were supposed to do when they caught him. And he said, I got into a traffic accident, unfortunately, and JD made it to the scene and got shot. He felt bad about it. And you can see a picture of him standing guard at the coffin that night. And, you know, it's strange. First of all, the Dallas police claimed they didn't know who Oswald was until they arrested him at 1:52 p.m. at the theater nearby. And they really didn't know who he was until 2:10 when they took him downtown, because he had two sets of identification on him. He had an alias. So they knew at around 12:45 at the latest who Oswald was and where he lived at Oak Cliff. They'll find this guy. And, you know, he's obviously designated as a suspect at that time, which there's no real reason. That APB report you mentioned really didn't describe him clearly. It said he was 30 years old, and I think it was 165 pounds. He was actually a lot thinner, and he was only 24. He had sort of balding hair, which could be mistaken for a little older man, but it also was a generic description that probably fit thousands of people walking around the streets that day. And it also said he's carrying a rifle. And, you know, if you see a guy carrying a rifle right after the presidential assassination, you might want to stop him. But Oswald was certainly not carrying a rifle, so that's unlikely that Tippit pulled him over for that reason. But I checked, and Menzel claimed to the, I guess it was the House Select Committee, that he was having lunch at a cafeteria nearby, and then he heard the report of the assassination on the radio and dashed out, which doesn't comport with the story he told Mrs. Tippit. But I found a record of an accident, car accident, about 2 blocks from the Tippit shooting scene, and I think it was 1:17 p.m. Menzel was sent to this minor traffic accident, fender bender, and he looked at it and he cleared the scene 2 minutes later. Now, even if it's a minor fender bender, it's hard to believe an officer would clear the scene 2 minutes later. You would take down names and addresses and all that kind of stuff, but he took off. So there was a traffic accident nearby, and I wonder if actually Menzel had that accident, as he told Mrs. Tippit. You know, he's racing around and bumps into a car. And anyway, so that casts a very different light on what Tippit was doing, and it helps explain why he was racing around, stopping a car and going into a record store trying for help. You know, there were also other reports of him using payphones around that time. If he was on the up and up, he could use the police radio to call the dispatch. But if you're on the payphone, it's a good way to disguise whatever you're doing. And he may have been saying, I can't find Oswald, or getting further orders. And very soon after that, he gets killed. So I think Tippit drove into an ambush that the police facilitated. And I could explain why. But first of all, the Tippit shooting scene is very confusing. It's like Rashomon, the Japanese film, where things are seen from different angles. There were about 20 people who were around that scene shortly at the time or shortly thereafter. And they really give very contradictory evidence. About 10 of them identified Oswald as the shooter. About 10 wouldn't identify him. Some people, like Mrs. Clemens, who was a domestic who worked nearby, and she heard the shots and came out onto the porch. She saw 2 men there. One was stocky, as you said, and Oswald certainly was not stocky. And the other guy was a tall, thin guy. And the 2 guys were, one guy waved to the other one to go on, and they went off in different directions. And other people said they saw 2 men. Somebody saw a guy in a car drive off, and there were those kind of witnesses. And then the ones who identified Oswald, a lot of them had, suspicious identifications. For example, the guy you mentioned who was closest to the shooting, Domingo Benavides, was an auto mechanic who was driving a pickup truck up the street in the opposite direction. And he saw the shooting, and he pulled over to the curb because he was worried about getting hit. And he said he waited for several minutes. That could have been an exaggeration. And peeked out over the thing, and he claimed he saw somebody running away, but he couldn't identify the shooter as Oswald. He told the police, so they never brought him to a lineup, and they never really even interviewed him. And 3 years later, CBS, which is one of the leading propaganda outlets, feeding us false stories on the assassination, I study them at length in the new book, Political Truth. They've done a series of elaborate reports purporting to close the book on the assassination. They interviewed a lot of witnesses in '66, including Benavides, and he then identified him 3 years later. Which is, and there was another guy, Warren Reynolds, was a used car salesman in a car lot about 2 blocks away. And when he heard the shooting, he went out and looked, and he saw somebody running away and couldn't identify him as Oswald. And so they didn't, people wouldn't identify it, and the police basically ignored them. But then the FBI came to see Reynolds about 2 months later, and he said, I can't identify Oswald. And then the next day, I believe it was, he got shot in the head by an intruder at the car lot. He miraculously survived. And then he said, oh yeah, it was Oswald. He saw that is my story here. And there were a lot of anomalies like that. And I kind of suspect I spent an awful lot of time trying to reconcile this stuff. Sometimes you can't totally reconcile these confusing scenes. There was a fellow named Jerry Rose who wrote in an assassination journal some years ago. He had a very interesting theory that he felt that Jack Ruby might have helped stage the Tippit murder, because a lot of the people who were there had connections with Ruby, like Helen Markham, the waitress. Ruby would come into her diner almost every night, and she knew him. And
didn't he have a house nearby too, near the neighborhood?
Yeah, Oswald. Allegedly, I think Oswald maybe went straight to the theater, but if you believe the official story, the route he was taking would take him to Jack Ruby's apartment house, not far away, which raised a lot of suspicions. And there are unconfirmed reports that Ruby and Oswald knew each other. I was never able to prove that, but T.F. Boley, the fellow I interviewed, who was the only person who looked at his watch, told me he knew Jack Ruby. Everybody knew Jack Ruby. He was the character around. But the only thing he didn't tell me, and this came out later, he got an award from the city of Dallas a few years ago. He told me when I interviewed him, it was the first interview he had ever given, except for he talked to the FBI. But he was very open, except he didn't tell me that he had actually worked for Jack Ruby at another club that Ruby ran. He was a bouncer at this club for a few years, and his wife knew Ruby, and he withheld that information from me. And I think that's why he probably didn't seek public attention for a long time. But he withheld that from me. But it's interesting, But Rose felt that Ruby had populated the scene with witnesses who would support his view, and Ruby might have been there. He might have been the stocky guy. Ruby was a short, stocky guy. He fits Mrs. Clemens' description. And there were other people who saw somebody like that there. And then Ruby was seen at Parkland Hospital not too long after that by Seth Cantor, who was a very reputable reporter who knew Ruby and later wrote a book about him. And Ruby grabbed him and said, should I close my nightclubs tonight? Which Cantor said, oh yeah, sure. And he thought that was kind of an odd request, but he could have gotten from the Tippit shooting scene to the hospital in time. The Warren Commission denied that Ruby was at the hospital. They said Seth Cantor was mistaken. Well, Cantor was a very good journalist and wrote about it. His notes are in the Warren volumes. So they discounted this important witness. But some of the witnesses who were connected with Ruby gave information that was not helpful to the official case. Mrs. Markham, with her confused testimony and the 106 time frame, and Boley arriving at 110. So if they were set up by Ruby, maybe they weren't, but they gave information that was not compatible with the official story. So it is kind of a confusing scene, and contradictions. Witnesses, there is a theory well known that eyewitnesses are not always trustworthy because memory plays tricks on you, and you can change your views for one reason or another. Intimidation, or sometimes people, their memory gets corrupted by reading about the case in the papers and stuff. And Emile D'Antonio, a great documentary filmmaker who I knew, made a film, Rush to Judgment, with Mark Lane, based on Lane's pioneering book. They went to Dallas in '66. They interviewed Mrs. Clemens, for example, a very candid interview with her. What a brave woman. She was a middle-aged Black woman working in Dallas, and told the truth. And she said on camera that policemen had come by with a gun and told her to be quiet or something might happen to you, but she spoke out anyway. Those are the real heroes of the case, these civilian witnesses who told the truth. But she disappeared after that interview, was never seen again. Nobody's able to find her. But D'Antonio said in an interview in the '60s that when they went to Dallas, Dealey Plaza was fine to shoot and nobody hassled them, but he said all the tension was at the Tippit scene. Everybody was afraid to talk, and said Mrs. Clemens, and they felt great tension there, so the Tippit scene is a fraught aspect of the case, but I advanced the case as far as I could, and I also tried to evaluate various people who might have killed Tippit. We can get into that, and I tried to assess the evidence. And I interviewed Tippit's mistress, Johnny Maxie Witherspoon. That's a whole story in itself. And there's some people who claim that her estranged husband killed Tippit. He was following them around out of jealousy, but I don't think he killed Tippit. But I went into that story as well. But she gave me a very candid interview.
So it seems like obviously the Dallas police know more about what happened with Tippit, and they're covering it up for whatever reason. But based on your decades of research, you kind of think maybe Tippit was his job that day, kind of, off the record, on those phones, was to take out Oswald, perhaps, or maybe get him out of town, or or kill him, or take him in. I mean, and he failed in that, and then.
Well, some people think, they speculated he was supposed to, as you say, take Oswald out of town to an airport nearby or help him escape. But I think that aspect of the story doesn't hold water in light of the fact that the Dallas police ordered Tippit and Menzel to find Oswald. And that proves, by the way, the Dallas police knew who Oswald was. They had a special unit, like a lot of police departments do, to monitor alleged communists, and like they called them red squads, dissidents, etc. And Oswald was on their list. And one way we knew that is when they put out his address, they gave an old address for Oswald, indicating they knew that he had lived in a different place. But they knew how to find him very quickly, and so it was a myth they put out that they didn't know this guy at all, and everybody was trying to cover their tracks. The FBI knew him well, and,
right?
But Tippit was, it's a question unresolved. Were they supposed to kill him or arrest him? And I lean toward possibly that they were going to eliminate him, because at the theater, not long after that, there was some evidence that he might have been set up for being shot in the theater, since he got that far. Policemen with guns were there, and one of them said he drew a gun on Oswald, and Oswald pushed him away and stopped it from shooting him. And Oswald had the presence of mind to shout loudly, "I'm not resisting arrest, I'm not resisting arrest." And there were some civilian witnesses who they took a list of the names of the people who were at the movie, 10 or 20 people, and that list has never shown up, too. That's another example.
Really?
Important evidence being buried, but a couple of the witnesses were known, and they were reporting odd behavior, Oswald moving from seat to seat, etc., probably looking for a contact. Spies and agents often have rendezvous in dark theaters if they're supposed to meet some contact, but So I think they were probably trying to kill him, and they failed in both places. And then eventually, soon after that, they had to have Jack Ruby go and kill him. They really had to silence him because he was starting to talk. And we don't even know what he was saying at the long interrogation sessions because they didn't keep a tape recorded record of it or have a stenographer there. Some notes have come out, and some of the people involved in the interrogations have given, accounts of it. You can't take those at face value.
That's pretty unbelievable, though, Joe. That they didn't have anybody taking notes. It's like really hard to believe,
Yeah, if they didn't want a tape recorder, and if they really needed one, they could go out and buy one real quickly. And
yeah, and he always maintained his innocence too. That's the thing that even some of the police say, right? I mean, they're like, come on, just admit to it. And if he did this thing and he wanted infamy and wanted to get caught, like, how come he never confessed to it? I mean, that's the other thing.
Yeah, that's the big silly part about the whole story, that the best people could come up with for a motive was that he wanted infamy, as you said, that he wanted to be an important guy. And well, yeah, okay, if that's the truth, why didn't he just proclaim, I shot Kennedy, and here's why I shot him? And he didn't. He was protesting his innocence. And all of them say, yeah, he never admitted killing either. And on his live press conference, which people can watch on YouTube, it's Wade said the purpose of that was just to show him to the press that he wasn't being seriously beaten up by the cops. He had a couple bruises from the scuffle at the theater, but he started talking, and you could tell that they were unhappy that he was talking to the press because he said, I don't know anything about this. I'm accused of murdering a policeman. And then some reporter says, you've been charged with murdering the president. He looks genuinely shocked, and Detective Lavelle told me he was shocked because we hadn't told him that. Mm-hmm. He heard it as he was being dragged through the halls, but he wasn't officially told that he was going to be charged with murdering the president. And he said, I request somebody to come forward to give me legal assistance. And I remember being, appalled and moved by that, as were many people around the country, that this guy didn't become a lawyer. And there's a story there. But so the question is, what happened? Why was Tippit killed? There are various theories that, you can't totally prove any of them, but there was a woman living nearby who looked out her window, and she said she saw a Dallas police car in the alley. Tippit pulled up right at an alley. He blocked the alley between two homes. And there was an alley there, and a police car allegedly was in the alley. And it is known that there were two women living at the corner house, the Davis sisters, who came out right away when they heard the shots, and they said policemen were already there. And the official story is the policeman didn't show up until, I think it was 1:20. The ambulance arrived at 1:19. And the ambulance was just like a few blocks away. There was a funeral home that had ambulances that serviced the police. And Boley told me he saw the policeman obviously dead on the street. And Benavides was trying to use the police radio, and he didn't know how to do it. But Boley worked for the telephone company, and he knew how to operate radios. So he picked up the radio and called in the report. And then they told him to get off the radio, and they said an ambulance would be coming. And then policemen started showing up. But according to the Davis sisters, policemen were already there. This would have been around 1:10 or thereabouts. What's that about? So there was another witness who said that he saw somebody walking from the alley who had first shot Tippit from the grass, next to the police car, shot Tippit, who was on the other side of the car. And Tippit fell, and this guy came back and gave him a coup de grace shot into the head. And if you look at the autopsy photos, there was a very good autopsy on Tippit. He has a bullet wound in the head, and he has bullet wounds in the chest. And that was to finish him off. It's also kind of a gangland signature to shoot somebody in the head, even if they're already dead. And then this guy went back and left in the police car. And there was an officer, Westbrook, who was the head of personnel, who was the suspicious figure in this case. And one reason I do books, is not only to fill gaps and correct errors and myths, but you hope that you will inspire other people to dig into the case, because the Tippit murder was still neglected when I started my research. But since then, I'm really glad other people are pursuing it, and it's become a big topic again. And some people have speculated on people I didn't focus on, like Captain Westbrook. He's the head of personnel. He was wearing a suit. He wasn't, a beat officer. And he was downtown, and he makes his way to Oak Cliff. Why is he out there? And he's kind of taking charge of the scene. And he may have been the guy in that car, and there may have been, the killer went away with him. And so that would make two people involved. And another person nearby saw this car in the alley, and some people dispute this, but Tippit, in my opinion, the best evidence so far indicates Tippit drove into a police ambush. He was shot for some reason by his own people.
Hmm.
And one reason it is scandalous that they didn't investigate the murder of the officer. For one thing. One thing I noticed on the police radio, I had the tape. When Kennedy is killed, the police seem very blasé about it. They don't seem excited. But when there's a report saying an officer was shot, suddenly they get excited. Everybody's voices rise, and there's a lot of fast traffic, a lot of people checking in. And I said to Jim Lavelle, I noticed that the police got a lot more excited about the killing of the policeman than they did of the president. He said, "That's right." He indicated, as is well known, when a policeman is shot, that's the number one thing that gets the police department upset, naturally. But in this case, it overrode the killing of the president, which is a bigger deal. But I said, "How do the police regard the shooting of the president?" And he said, well, he broke into this sort of sly little smile, and he said, well, it's like an old saying, it weren't no different from a from a South Dallas N-word shooting. That's what he said. And he used the actual N-word. Wasn't that any different?
When you interviewed him, right, he used that language and was pretty much unabashedly openly racist, according to your book. And another thing I think you touch on in your book too was some of the Dallas police were members of the Klan or peripherally related to the Klan, and may have also moonlighted as security connected to other places, including Tippit, right? I mean, isn't it possible that he was a bouncer, or he worked security at like a restaurant or something like that, or a club?
Yeah, I could fill you in there. I mean, one of the most amazing, Lavelle was a great interview. I mean, he seemed to kind of, tell me a lot of truth. I mean, you have to ask the right questions to get people to open up. And
Right.
he obviously covered up some things, but, he and Wade were more forthcoming than I expected, and I got good interviews out of them. I've been interviewing people my whole life. I've interviewed estimated 15,000 people. I think I'm a good interviewer. I get people to open up and tell me things that they wouldn't tell otherwise. But what was the thing you were asking about? I know this. Oh, the Klan. Yeah, I was interviewing Morris Brumley, who was a retired detective. He was the oldest friend of Tippit that I could find. He went to school with Tippit in East Texas. They grew up together. I actually interviewed another man who was in that period, but Brumley had continued to be his friend all through the police period. And Brumley, as we were talking, we had lunch at a diner in Dallas, and I had my tape recorder on the table right in front of me. And Brumley started telling me how he had been a Klan member, and he pulled out his wallet and proudly showed me his Ku Klux Klan membership card signed by the Grand Dragon and all this, writing down the information. So I said, well, what was that all about? And he said, well, I infiltrated the Klan for Dallas police. But then he started boasting with this really evil smile about how they had castrated black men and whipped them and horrible stuff. And when you interview somebody, you try to keep a straight face, because if you express shock or surprise, even sometimes people clam up. And unfortunately, as the story went on, I couldn't restrain myself from saying something. I said, well, you were infiltrating them for Dallas police. Did you report any of these crimes that took place in whipping and castrating? And he immediately clammed up. I wish wish I'd done it a little differently, but I have this on tape. And I asked a Dallas area researcher about this, and he laughed and said, infiltrating the Klan, he said about 3/4 of the Dallas Klan were Dallas policemen. It was a deeply racist place, and so you got Klans members all over the place. Tippit worked for a barbecue stand called Austin's Barbecue, which was in Oak Cliff, and it was a hangout for local teenagers. And it was near the police station in that area where Tippit worked out of. But Tippit had been a security guard there from 61 to 63. And I interviewed Austin Cook, who ran the barbecue place, very affable fellow. He was a John Birch Society member, very, right-wing guy. And I found out through him and other people, a lot of the prominent right-wingers in Dallas hung out at Austin's Barbecue. I mean, I found stories about it saying everybody went to Austin's Barbecue. Well, they certainly did. It was like a hub of right-wing activity.
It was the scene, huh? You get good barbecue there and talk John Birch.
Great barbecue, but also to talk about your right-wing views. One of the most right-wing people there was Deputy DA Bill Alexander, who I interviewed briefly. He was the real technical guy. He got angry and asked him questions. He was fired by Henry Wade for being too right-wing because he's publicly said that Earl Warren should be hanged. Alexander was quick to get to the Tippit murder scene, and he carried a gun, and he was bragged about how he'd love to shoot suspects, and he was a real flaming right-wing nut.
Now, was it Wade who is profiled in Thin Blue Line, that documentary that came out later on, and they showed most of his cases, or if not all, were fraudulent or corrupt, that arrests that he made and prosecutions?
Yeah, he was notorious for running a very corrupt legal system there. He's the Wade in Roe versus Wade, by the way. He's the opposing.
Oh, really? Same guy? Jeez. Boy, he's quite a historical figure, huh?
Yeah, and he went to University of Texas with John Connolly and Hem Jones and other people, and they all
kidding
knew each other. But Wade was a very affable fellow, but he did a terrible job on the Oswald case, and he prosecuted Jack Ruby too, and he would have prosecuted Oswald if he had lived. But Alexander worked for him, but other right-wing figures hung out there. And Austin Cook knew General Edwin Walker, who was a very famous right-winger living in Dallas. He'd been fired by President Kennedy from a high position in the Army because he was trying to indoctrinate the troops in Europe with John Birch Society literature and things like that. And he was one of the main ringleaders at the University of Mississippi riots when they integrated the university. Two people were killed, and Walker was a real trouble rouser. And Austin Cook knew him, and he said their little Birch Society group had Walker talk to them and his guest, and so it is clear that Tippit was operating in a milieu in which he would be known to various prominent right-wingers and police and district attorneys, people, because he's working in this barbecue 2 nights a week, and he was in uniform too, and so they could have recruited him into a plot. And I think Tippit was somehow involved in the plot. I mean, obviously, he and Menzel were involved in the plot if they were told to find Oswald long before Oswald was officially known. Oswald was obviously the designated patsy, even right at that time. They said, "Okay, go get him." And Tippit also worked as a security guard at a theater, Spanish language theater, which was known for the owner was involved in drug trafficking, among other things. And during the Warren Commission hearings, there was an odd comment. Allen Dulles, the former head of the CIA, who was fired by Kennedy after the Bay of Pigs, asked Chief Curry, there's a rumor that Officer Tippit was involved in drug trafficking, and Curry said, "I know nothing about that. That's just kind of a hanging thing that is, we don't know much about that." But one thing, I studied, there's that old saying, "Follow the money," which actually the screenwriter William Goldman invented for All the President's Men. It wasn't actually said during Watergate, but he wrote that. It's a very good line, follow the money. So I was trying to follow Tippit's finances, and he had something like $463 a month, which wasn't much. But he and his wife owned 2 homes. They had mortgages heavily on 2 homes, but they had moved from a home and then they rented it out, and then they were living in a different home. And how does a guy have 2 homes and a meager salary? And he obviously supplemented it with these security guard gigs. But also, the summer of '63, he apparently came into some money because he and his family, and including some siblings, went on a trip to Grand Canyon and other places. And his father told me JD bought him a pickup truck around that time, and Mrs. Tippit said they bought a new station wagon around that time. They had 2 cars. So they were kind of living beyond their means, which would suggest that he was getting money from some illicit source. And then they had a mistress, and they tried to paint him as a good family man. One of the things you mentioned, that it was odd that they didn't want to report facts about the case. It is very strange. Your brother officer is killed. You want to solve the crime. But they basically dropped the case after Oswald was shot because they pinned it on him. And they should have, looked into it. And Lavelle claimed, well, we kept the case open, and occasionally I'd get a tip and I'd investigate it, but they clearly didn't care. And one theory is that, if JD was involved in the plot, they certainly didn't want to probe into that, but he was not a good family man, as they claimed. He had a mistress, and he had other women, and he was involved in various things. But Johnny Maxey Witherspoon really opened up to me. She was a waitress at Austin's Barbecue, and they'd had a sexual relationship for months, and if not longer. And she got pregnant around that time. She found out she was pregnant in the fall of '63, and she had a daughter in April '64. And some people think that daughter is Tippit's child. Tippit had 2 sons and a daughter with Marie Tippit, but this other woman could have been his child. But Mrs. Witherspoon told me that she claimed JD had a vasectomy, and that had never come out. Vasectomies were uncommon back then, but they were given. She said her husband, Steve Thompson, was the father of the child. But there is a theory that what Tippit was doing when he was shot was having a rendezvous with Johnny Maxey Witherspoon, who was telling him she was pregnant, what are we going to do about it, panicking or whatever. And it is known that the husband, Steve Thompson, was following them around. He was jealous. But she said that she and Steve got back together again after the Tippit was killed. And she said, I really love Tippit, a good guy, etc. And Marie Tippit came into Austin's Barbecue not long after the killing and was trying to find out from people. She was making kind of a scene about who's this waitress JD allegedly is involved in, because for one thing, she found flowers on the grave, and there was a note there, and Mrs. Thompson or Mrs. Witherspoon said, yeah, I left the flowers on the grave for the note. And I said, what was the note? She said, I'm not going to tell you. But Austin said the note was something like, to the best man I ever knew. Something very naturally was concerned. And she even went to Helen Markham's house, because Markham was a waitress. But she was a middle-aged woman, and not terribly looking or anything. But Mrs. Tippit was accusing Helen Markham of maybe being JD's mistress. So Mrs. Tippit was aware of her husband's philandering, which contradicts the whole story about him being a great family man. There's even a rumor that I could never track down, that the day of the killing, Marie had asked her husband for divorce that day. And but I mentioned that to Mrs. Witherspoon. She said Tippit wanted to divorce his wife, and so it's a different kind of story. And Marie Tippit would not talk to me. I tried to reach her, and she just stonewalled me. She was surrounded by Dallas police for the rest of her life. And
yeah, didn't she just die a couple of years ago?
Yeah, she just died. And after the book came out, I went to Dallas again in 2014. at the sixth floor museum, which is this sort of, Oswald did it museum.
Yeah, I was actually there 3 years ago today at the museum.
Yeah, it's interesting, but it's so slanted. But they do have public discussions with witnesses that are useful, and you can see some online. But they scheduled one on Tippit's 90th birthday with Mrs. Tippit and her two surviving children. So I flew to Dallas. I thought, here's a chance to maybe talk to Mrs. Tippit. And at the end of the speech, I went over to Marie Tippit and introduced myself and said I would put the book on the case. And she was very, very nice. She seems like, in some ways, a very nice lady. And she was very cordial. And I said, I'll be here for a day or two. Could I come tomorrow and interview you? And she seemed willing to do it. And Gary Mack, who was this guy who used to be a conspiracy theorist who had gotten a $200,000 a year job with the Sixth Floor Museum as a curator, sold out to the other side and started saying Oswald did it. He was standing there frantically signaling this policeman who was Mrs. Tippit's minder. And this guy came over, and I have photographs of this. A friend of mine was photographing this. The guy intervened, and he said, "Hi, I'll take care of I handled her interview request." And he gave me his card, and I gave him my card. And he said, "We'll get back to you." Of course, they never got back to me, and Mrs. Tippit didn't do the interview. But Gary Mack was, stifling this interview. And then as the little gathering continued, I went over to Curtis Tippit, who's the officer's youngest son, and he was there that day for lunch. Allegedly, his father had lunch at home and went off and got killed. But I can talk about that because it's reflecting stories on that. But Curtis seemed like a really nice guy, a very affable fellow. I was talking to him, and I was just getting to know him. And the same officer saw us. He came charging over. He grabbed Curtis by the arm without saying a word and pulled him away from me. I don't know what Curtis thought was going on.
Wow.
I mean, they really kept a clamp on it. And I was told by Dallas researchers that police cars were always outside Marie's home for 40-odd years. What would it be, 50 years? I mean, they really...
That's strange. Yeah, that's really strange.
Yeah. She gave interviews over the years, and I dug up everyone I could find. And she gave conflicting stories about the lunch that supposedly happened. The JD, she claimed came home for lunch. She gave various times, which is somewhat suspicious, although, she could be confused, from 11:30 onward. And then when they heard that Kennedy was shot, he left, and then soon after that, he gets killed. So they had a quick lunch. But her son, Alan, was in school that morning and got really ill and had to come home, which is kind of interesting. Alan supposedly told a researcher late in his life that morning his father said, "No matter what happens today, I want you to know that I love you." He said his father had never been that openly affectionate before, but that story is disputed. But we don't know what Alan knew. Alan wound up having a lot of trouble with the law himself. It's a sad story because, without a father, Mrs. Tippit remarried a couple of times, but they still have a son. Alan died of cancer. I never got to talk to him. But anyway, Marie Tippit gave a lot of conflicting stories about the lunch and how long JD was there and all kinds of anomalies, which I always find interesting because I wonder if the lunch didn't happen, if it was an alibi, because he was 7 miles from where he was shot. I mean, and the president's in town. A lot of these officers claim they're having lunch in a very nonchalant way when the president was in town, and you'd think everybody would be on the alert. And there was a neighbor across the street who, there's another guy, Dale Myers, wrote what I call the Warren Report of the Tippit case. He had published this book before mine. It's called With Malice. The title alone shows that this case was loaded against Oswald, and he slants all the evidence in the Oswald direction. And then the stories that contradict that, he puts in the book in footnotes, so you can say they're in the book, but he disputes them all, and everything. Well, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. But there was a woman he found, Mrs. Rumbly, who lived across the street, who allegedly saw Tippit leaving in his squad car. So I found Mrs. Rumbly and I interviewed her 3 times. And a nice lady, and she wrote a book about Oak Cliff and all this, but her story didn't match the known facts in many ways. I really broke down her story after a while. It seemed to me that what she saw was, a couple days before, maybe Tippit was home with the police car and then left, and she somehow conflated that with the day of the assassination. So her story doesn't hold water, but the jury is still out on this lunch, and I mean, another theory that other people put out, and I investigated this, was that Tippit had been one of the shooters in Dealey Plaza. There was a character called Badge Man, and actually Gary Mack, who I just mentioned, who went over
Yeah.
the dark side, helped discover this. So there was a great photo researcher in Fort Worth named Jack White, who I interviewed, very nice, serious guy, and he was an expert on photography, and there was a great Polaroid picture taken by Marianne Norman. She was about 15 feet from Kennedy when he was shot, and she took a picture right around the time of the headshot. And unfortunately, since it's Polaroid, it's a bit murky, but in the background, you can see the concrete retaining wall on the grassy knoll, and then there's the wooden fence. And a number of credible witnesses said they saw and heard a shot from the fence, the wooden fence. There was even smoke there. But other people, there are 7 photos or frame enlargements from films of a human shape in black, dressed in black, leaning on the retaining wall at the time of the shooting, and then that figure vanishes soon after that. And Jack White was able to do photo enhancement, not changing it, but bringing out different levels of light, and revealed what looks like a policeman right behind the retaining wall. And the policeman, you can see the badge, you can see the shoulder patch, and there's a kind of muzzle flash right in front of it that looks to be firing a weapon. And that would be a perfect angle for the fatal headshot, which hit Kennedy in the right temple, contrary to what the official version was, and blew out the back of its head. Anyway, this policeman is dubbed Badge Man. And some people said, well, he's somebody dressed as a policeman. Well, maybe he was an actual policeman. But the interesting thing was, when I started my research on Tippit, I was struck by the fact that there were very few pictures of him. In the Warren volumes, there are 2 pictures of him, one from 1952 and one from 57, and he looked a lot different over the years, as most of us do. In 57, the picture was, you couldn't see his eyes very well, it's kind of shadowy, he's wearing a cap. And there were no pictures of him close to the shooting, and I thought, that's odd, are they trying to hide what he looked like so people wouldn't say, I saw that guy in this place and that. But when I went to the Sixth Floor Museum on one of my visits, they had a display of photos of Tippit, and somebody had come up with a photo from 62, it was around Thanksgiving, and he looked a lot older and more weathered, and he had a very distinctive hairline that had kind of a funny notch. If you look at it, it's very distinctive. And the Badgeman figure has exactly that hairline. And when I saw that, I thought, it's typically Badgeman. And he could have theoretically fired the shot and gotten to Oakland by 12:45 because the viaduct is only 5 minutes from downtown. And if you have a police car, you could get through the traffic. So, but the lunch story would tend to contradict him being at Dealey Plaza in time to shoot Kennedy, because it's a long way from his home to Dealey Plaza. So that's why the lunch story is so important. But there were people who saw the policeman. There was a black couple, young man and woman, who were seated on a bench behind the retaining wall, and they said a policeman was there and fired a shot and then left and brushed past them, and they were terrified. And being black in Dallas in 1963 was a dangerous end. And they weren't about to come forward and say, I saw policemen shooting Kennedy. But they came out later in an interview. So, in other words, there is some interesting evidence there. And that would account for, if that were true, why Tippit, that would be a reason why Tippit was killed. Because if you think about it, Kennedy's killed at 12:30. The policeman is killed about 1:08, and then Oswald is arrested at 1:52. It makes the Dallas police look like geniuses in a certain sense. They wrapped it all up within an hour and a half.
Yeah, to be able to button it up that quickly and have their guy.
Yeah, some people even claim that without speculating about Tippit. They say, well, they caught the killer within less than an hour and a half. They did a pretty damn good job. I mean, they did a terrible job. There are all kinds of things that they did wrong, especially letting the prisoner be shot. There were 60 policemen and a lot of reporters. And like one was at the police station when the prize suspect was shot. And it's clearly facilitated by the Dallas police. And people have studied that. And they have names.
Oh, Ruby being able to get into the garage there and shoot Oswald. Yeah.
Yeah, they should have transferred him in the middle of the night, and there was even a warning called into the station. Somebody said, Oswald's going to get killed, but they transferred him in view of everybody and let this guy in. And he knew everybody in the Dallas police force. He was basically the mob's bagman with the Dallas police. He had this strip club downtown, and he would let policemen come in and drink for free, and he would give them girls to dally with them. A lot of the people involved in the case had been cronies of Jack Ruby, and he was the bagman, so he was the guy if they needed to get policemen to do anything, he'd be the intermediary. He may have been much more involved in the plot than people think. It wasn't so much that he was just told, at the last minute to shoot Oswald. There's some evidence that he might have planted the so-called magic bullet at Parkland, and he may have been at the Tippit murder scene. And there's an extraordinary testimony by him in the Dallas jail. Earl Warren and Gerald Ford, who was another Warren commissioner, came down to Dallas to get his testimony. But Ruby was in jail, and he was afraid for his life being in the Dallas jail, and he felt constrained in talking. And Carl Oglesby wrote a great book called The Yankee and Cowboy War, which is about how Watergate and Kennedy assassination, some of the same players were involved, etc. But he has a long deconstruction of Ruby's testimony, and it's rather moving because Ruby was trying to tell the truth, but he felt constrained, and he was begging Warren to take him to Washington. He said, if you take me to Washington, I can speak more freely. And Warren said, well, I don't think there's any reason for that. And Ruby kind of gives up and says, well, you've lost me, Mr. Chief Justice. And he also was hinting broadly that he was involved in the plot. And Warren said, well, we've had no testimony to that effect, Mr. Ruby. And said, yes, but you don't know the evidence here. I mean, they were willfully ignorant of the evidence. They didn't want to hear any stories from this guy. And they didn't even want to know much about his mob connections. There were many phone calls, for example, on the record, a flurry of phone calls in November between Ruby and various mob figures, and they really should have investigated that. They didn't want to know.
Oh yeah, or his connections to gun running, and what I find fascinating that I learned recently from Tom O'Neill's book Chaos was that Jack Ruby was visited by the CIA mind control doctor Jolly West. And after that was declared not insane, but the West was like, oh, I'm treating him, and it's of my opinion that he's got mental issues or schizophrenia or something. And of course, it wasn't disclosed at that time who Jolly West was or what he was up to. But here's the guy who was in charge of MK Ultra and unwittingly drugging people and mind control experiments, and that's the guy they had in there with Ruby. It's like. Yeah. It's just one of those connections that's just wild.
Yeah, he survived until 67, and he claimed that the cancer he died from was injected into him, which is possible. But he was a sad case because he did mentally deteriorate in custody, but he knew a lot more than he let on, but he wasn't allowed to speak freely, and people just ignored what he said. They thought he was schizoid, and he did say some things that were paranoid, like he thought Jews were being murdered in the basement of the police station and things like that.
Yeah, that's what he was saying after he was visited by Jolly West.
Yeah. I mean, they could have given him drugs to produce madness. But he was an important figure who was not investigated clearly. Seth Cantor wrote a good book called "Who Was Jack Ruby," and that's one of the better books in the case. But in my recent book, "Political Truth: The Media and the Assassination of President Kennedy," um, I've been aware for a long time since I was a kid. I told you that when I heard the radio reports, I first smelled a rat when they changed the story 20 minutes into the case without explaining it. That's always been a red flag for me, is when the official story changes like that. Um, Barry Levinson, who made Wag the Dog, which is a good film, and it shows you how they can manufacture visual evidence today. It's very easy to fake evidence in that case to support a phony war. Levinson said, he said, find out what's happening within an hour or two after the event, because they can change the so-called evidence quickly. Now today it'd be a lot quicker, maybe half an hour. But I always thought that was true, that if I would always, that's why I ran to radio. I wanted to hear the first reports. Now, obviously, some first reports are misleading because people are confused and all that. But often, and it's convenient. The mainstream media often say early reports are almost always wrong. It takes a while for the truth to come out. Well, I think first reports in a shooting or things like that are often more true than the cover story, which takes a little while to assemble.
Definitely.
Within 2 or 3 hours, J. Edgar Hoover already said we've clinched the case. Oswald did it. Well, there's no possible way you could know that within 2 or 3 hours, and then they declared Oswald was the lone suspect, and but I heard the early reports that contradicted the official report, and if you look at many witnesses, uh, researchers have gone to, and there's a wealth of contradiction of things. Many people, for example, saw the limousine stop briefly and then drive off. And in the Zapruder film, you see it slowing down, but it doesn't quite stop. And that's suspicious. But there were like 57 people who saw it stop or come to a near stop. And I interviewed Senator Ralph Yarborough, who was riding in the car with Lyndon Johnson and his wife, 2 cars behind. They were the third car behind the presidential limousine. He said the car stopped, the limousine stopped, and he said Secret Service men were jumping out of the follow-up car and swarming the car, and you don't see that in the Zapruder film. And then they took off. So the Zapruder film has been altered. This is some of these things I found hard to believe for a while, that there could be a second Oswald, but that's very common in tradecraft, where they have 2 or more people with the identity, so they can use it for plausible denial. If the guy does something in one city, they could say no, he was somewhere else. And also, the whole idea of the Zapruder film, we kind of bought that it was a true record of things, but the film went to the CIA laboratory in Rochester, secret laboratory they had that weekend, and it was altered. And Douglas Horn, who is a very good researcher working for the Assassination Records Review Board, did exhaustive studies. He did a 5-volume set of books on the case, and part of it is demonstrating conclusively that the Zapruder film was altered. 2 CIA photo experts that weekend were brought copies of the Zapruder film to make frame enlargement blow-ups and put them on briefing boards so they could show the president and the head of the CIA and very small audience. And those 2 guys, who were both reputable, gave different stories. They didn't know the other guy was working on the briefing board, so it was compartmentalized. And the fellow who was the #1 expert described the film he worked on in ways that contradicted the Zapruder film as we have it now, like the explosion on his head, which shows debris kind of in a burst of red there. It's only one frame in the film, which defies credibility. But he said no, it was a bigger explosion that went backwards for several frames, and the policeman riding in the motorcycle to the left of the motorcycle was sprayed in the face by debris from Kennedy's head. He actually thought he'd been shot in the face. It was so sharp, and it was covering his helmet and his face. And there are a lot of ways you can corroborate this stuff. And the worst thing, though, the big hole that you see in the Zapruder film, which goes from the side of Kennedy's head all over the top, it's like one gigantic hole and this flap. Well, the doctors and nurses at Parkland Hospital, none of them described a wound like that. All of them described a wound in the back of the head about the size of a grapefruit. And Kennedy's brains were oozing out of the hole. And there was also, I discovered a FBI document that really destroys the Warren report. One of the top officials at the FBI, the night of the shooting, wrote a memo and he said, a bullet is lodged behind the president's right ear and rear in the process of obtaining it. This was when the official autopsy was being conducted. That bullet was never entered into evidence. But there were witnesses, including Secret Service agents and civilians, who said that we saw a bullet hit him in the right temple, and that's probably what blew up the back of his head. But the wound changed between Dallas and Parkland. And one of the things that I found most striking when I was getting into my research, in William Manchester's authorized book on the assassination in 1967, he described, and I had never heard this before, of this tug of war over Kennedy's coffin in the in the halls of the hospital as they were trying to leave. And the Dallas medical examiner, Earl Rose, who did excellent autopsies on Oswald and Tippit, was trying to say, no, wait a minute, Texas law mandates in a homicide, the autopsy has to be conducted here, and I'm the guy who's supposed to do it. And the Secret Service and Kenny O'Donnell, who was one of Kennedy's aides, were trying to force the coffin through the hallway. And Mrs. Kennedy was standing there, and they were using profanity, and they were waving guns around. I mean, this is really kind of shocking. I read this. And they were trying to, they pushed Earl Rose up against the wall at one point, and they pushed the coffin through. But they actually called, there was a justice of the peace on the scene. And I talked to Henry Wade about this, and Wade said, yeah, it was my call. The JP called me, and I said, let him take the coffin back to Washington. It's at worst, it's $100 fine. He even kind of laughed about it, like, good deal, but they stole the body at gunpoint. And I thought, why did this happen? This wasn't reported in 1963. I wondered, and David Lifton wrote an important book called Best Evidence, which is another paradigm changer for me in 1980, that Kennedy's body was altered at, he was not sure if it was Walter Reed Hospital or Bethesda. Before the official autopsy, there was unofficial autopsy and work done on the president's head surreptitiously. And Horn found actual witnesses who saw two doctors, including one of the autopsy doctors, hammering away at the president's head between 6:55 and 7:05. The official autopsy didn't start till 8:15, but they were removing bullet evidence and making that giant hole in Kennedy's head. And he proved that to me. And the bullet behind the ear disappeared, and the doctors and nurses were great witnesses at Parkland, honest people. And then they made, Kennedy had a shot in the windpipe, and the doctors who attended him, the number 1 and 2 doctors that afternoon, gave a press conference, and they said several times it was the entrance wound coming at him.
Yeah.
they made a tracheotomy in his neck to put a windpipe in. They put a tube in there, but the tracheotomy is strange because it's a huge slash. And you don't make, a good doctor doesn't make a huge slash like that. It looks like something where they excavated the wound to remove evidence. But,
yeah, it looked mutilated for sure to cover that it was an entry wound.
Yeah, and that's what Lifton calls the best evidence is the body. But even in the press, I tracked this in my research. I'm so interested in how the media mislead us on many stories. And little stories kept leaking out into the press for a couple of months that contradicted the official story. It took until the spring before they came up with the single bullet theory, which tried to justify the number of shots by describing this unlikely trajectory between Kennedy's neck, they called it, and Connolly, and it just is preposterous. But they even moved the location of the back wound from the shoulder up to the neck. Gerald Ford, people have found a document where he wrote in handwriting. He changed the location of the wound, and this came out, and that's tampering with evidence. But so the media, the official story took a while to coalesce as these things happened. There were leaks. And there were reports, for example, in the Washington Post and New York Times that the doctors at the autopsy couldn't find a wound of transit between the back and the front of Kennedy. The back wound was so shallow, one of the doctors put his finger in it, it only went in, about half a finger length, and it stopped. There was no bullet there, and they couldn't find a bullet in the body. And that's the wound that supposedly was, the entrance wound for the magic bullet that allegedly went through Kennedy, but it didn't. And but the press reported some of these things, but they very quickly fell into line and swallowed the official story. And there was a leak in June of '64 to the New York Times, which is one of the worst culprits in this lying. To this date, they lie about the case. In my book, Political Truth, I really go into the Washington Post and the New York Times and CBS most specifically. Bernstein, in his Rolling Stone article, said the most heavily CIA infiltrated media are the New York Times, CBS, and Time Life, Time Incorporated, which bought the Zapruder film and took it under wraps, for example. And Bernstein went light on his old paper, the Washington Post, but they're one of the worst. Even to this day, they keep.
Oh, so spooky.
Huh?
They're very spooky. Yeah, I mean, Ben Bradley, wasn't he the owner or the CEO at one time, and he was connected to Cord Meyer, right, and other CIA agents.
Well, he was the managing editor. Catherine Graham was the publisher. Her husband, Phil Graham, who killed himself in '63.
That's right.
Had been involved with the CIA for a long time. With Frank Wisner, they created what they called Operation Mockingbird in around '51 to recruit members of the media to work for the CIA. And Graham was heavily involved in that. And Bradley was a friend of Kennedy, wrote a book about his friendship with Kennedy. But he, oddly, if you're a friend, why not investigate his murder? And Mort Saul, a comedian who got blacklisted over being involved in investigating the case, said Kennedy had a strange set of friends, very absent when he died. After he was shot down like a dog in the street, they abandoned him. And Bradley was one of them. He lied about the case for a long time and let his paper lie. And now the new owner, Jeff Bezos, is openly involved with the CIA. Post has always been kind of a CIA front, but now they're not even a front; it's open.
Yeah, they're open about it. So, have you ever talked to any former or intelligence agents, maybe at the time, who had questions or questioned the official story, or gave you any kind of hints, or agreed with your kind of your train of thinking?
One story that I broke, which is very influential in 1988, was the George H.W. Bush.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about that. Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, in my research, going through 100,000 pages of microfilm, that were released under the Freedom of Information Act in 77 and 78, I discovered a number of documents about George W. Bush being somehow connected with the case. And one document described him as Mr. George Bush of the CIA. This was November 29th, 63. J. Edgar Hoover was briefing him and a couple of other people about the actions of the anti-Castro Cubans in Miami, who were among the suspects in the case. And so Bush was involved with the CIA long before he became its director in 76. And I had a very good source with intelligence connections who confirmed that. This fellow was involved in the Bay of Pigs operation, and he said, yeah, Bush was involved in that. And, but I found more evidence that I couldn't really prove. The Bushes are very good at hiding their tracks, that he probably was involved back in the 50s. And it's since come out. Russ Baker did a good book kind of taking off. And the book starts with me discovering this document. And I wrote a piece for The Nation, and then I wrote 2 follow-up pieces, the third of which they wouldn't run. But it caused quite a stir because Bush was running for president. And my son says that I predicted everything that happened since Bush became president. I didn't quite predict 9/11, but, I predicted false wars and all kinds of stuff. Because, when you study the Bush family, they've done a lot of terrible things for many years. His father was...
They really have. They're a real cadre of ghouls, and it's been fascinating to see the rebranding they've done of W, since he left office, which is kind of appalling to me. It's like, oh, he's good. He paints now. He's a painter, and we're gonna have him come dance on Ellen, and he's very grandfatherly. And forget about the CIA stuff and the wars and torture and the 9/11 cover-up. But pay no attention to that.
Yeah, it's one of the worst things that happened in recent years. Trump is so bad that he makes George W. Bush a little better by comparison. But people forget the torture and two false wars and all kinds of other terrible things, and loss of our civil liberties. And so I connect all this in political truth with the assassination. Most people, when I was a kid in the early 60s, we really believed the government. And I was, naive kid, raised in a Democratic Party family, and thought the Democratic Party was really great and the government was honest. And, but that took a nosedive, starting with the Kennedy assassination. People were very skeptical. From the beginning, there was a Gallup poll about a week later, and the majority of people thought Oswald didn't act alone. They didn't realize he didn't act at all. But the Warren report in '64, people started believing the official story again. But then with the Vietnam War, this is the commonly held view. The Vietnam War is what caused faith in government to fall apart, because they were so flagrantly lying to us about the war. Johnson was trying to cover up the extent of the war, and the public started being very disenchanted, which is true. But the Vietnam War was an outgrowth of the Kennedy assassination, because 2 days after Kennedy was shot, Johnson secretly reversed Kennedy's decision to start winding down the troops. Kennedy had already issued an order publicly to pull 1,000 troops out of Vietnam, and they were going to try to wind the war down. And Johnson reversed that secretly with Henry Cabot Lodge, the ambassador to South Vietnam, and Dean Rusk, and others at a secret meeting. But they put out false stories, and I tracked the false stories in the press that, well, there's no real change in policy in Vietnam between Kennedy and Johnson. That's still the official line of historians. Like one thing I did for Political Truth was to get a hold of history textbooks that are used in AP courses in the country right now. And they lie about the case, and they don't say much about it. It's very short, one paragraph usually, and they say this, loner Oswald shot him, and that's about it. And a couple of them say, well, there's some controversy surrounding it, but they don't really dig into it. And this is one of the most important developments in American history. And some well-known, reputable historians, most establishment historians, Robert Caro, for example, bought the myth of his 4th volume of his Johnson biography. And, you can't really get published by mainstream publishers if you're questioning that official story. That and 9/11 are kind of the third rails of American politics. You're not supposed to.
Oh, definitely. Well,
But
I mean, you mentioned Oswald's brother earlier, Robert. He lived a good long life, and he always publicly said that he thought his brother did it. But, maybe he really knew deep down that he didn't do it, but he had a family, he had kids, and it was just easier for him and to say that and toe the official line. I don't know. Did you ever talk to Oswald's brother or?
no, he didn't really give interviews. He wrote a book on his brother, condemning his brother. He's a traitor to his own brother. But he was a kind of, conventional, upstanding businessman. But he was, yeah. I mean, a lot of people. I've talked to members of the press and book editors. People will say, "Well, yeah, I think there was a conspiracy, but I can't really say that because, like I pitched Political Truth in an earlier. I wrote a long proposal. I pitched it to publishers in the '90s, and one editor said, "Well, I think there was a conspiracy. We can't publish a book like that because we rely so heavily on the New York Times for reviews of our books that if we publish a book saying they lied about this big story, it's going to screw that up." So that's kind of the attitude of a lot of people. I suspect a lot of the reporters in Washington and New York know better, but they don't want to stick their neck out because access is so important in the media that you look at Helen Thomas, who was a real honest, good driving reporter. My mother worked with her. My mother covered the White House in the '60s. And Helen Thomas and my mother helped integrate the Washington Press Club, getting women in there as members. And Helen Thomas told me that my mother was a great reporter, which we knew. But it was nice to hear it from her. She started asking tough questions during the Bush-Cheney regime about the wars, and she was basically she was always sitting in the front row and always called on early, and then they stopped calling on her. And she lost her job with the UPI after many years and wound up writing for a throwaway paper in the Washington area. I mean, that's what happens if you question the official story. You lose your position, you lose your big salaries. And one thing that's changed. My parents were middle class people. They didn't get a lot of money for being reporters in the '50s or '60s, but now the reporters get big bucks. And TV networks get millions. And so when you do that, you start thinking like the establishment more and more. Back in my parents' day, they were honest reporters, but they were like ordinary people, trying to tell the truth. And I respect a lot of reporters. There are a few reporters in this case who tried to tell the truth and they get shot down for it. But I admire Jefferson Morley, for example, is a guy formerly with the Washington Post who left partly because they wouldn't let him investigate the case. He's the one who's been pursuing this George Joannides matter. And who he was a CIA guy who was very involved with the Miami station, which is where the virulent Kennedy-hating anti-Castro Cubans were, and George H.W. Bush had connections there. Joannides was probably involved in the framing of Oswald, but when the House Select Committee reinvestigated the case, they were going to probe more deeply into the CIA connections. And Joannides was assigned by the CIA as their liaison. And he didn't tell the HSDA that he had been involved in '63 with events surrounding Oswald and the Miami station. He somehow concealed that. And so he kept misleading them. And so Morley's been trying to get declassified a lot of documents about Joannides and what he actually did. He probably helped frame Oswald and then misdirect the story. And the CIA is very vehement covering that up. And so, why are they withholding documents? Well, their culpability and their credibility will take another hit if these documents ever come out. And I suspect next month, Biden will probably release some documents, but some will be still hidden away. And that's unfortunately the pattern. But the media just slavishly buy the government stories, and they have a lot to lose. Norman Mailer observed that they have a lot to lose if they ever go to conspiracy. They blew the case from day one, and they've been lying about it ever synopsis. A classic example, Tom Wicker in the New York Times he wrote the banner story the next day about the assassination. He was in Dallas, he was in the motorcade, and he quoted accurately the doctors saying the entrance of the shot in the throat was the entrance wound. But then the headline says Kennedy killed by sniper singular. So, and then the story also says, a sniper shot him from the warehouse. But the story contradicts itself because of the shot at the throat. And Wicker became one of the most vehement anti-conspiracy people attacking Oliver Stone's JFK. Very angry about it. But I even found in the 66 or 67, even he was starting to wonder about it. He wrote a column saying, well, there are some unanswered questions in all ways. But he quickly reversed field, as most of them did. They just don't want to know the official story because, for one thing, it'll make them look like fools, and of course, and they don't like to admit error. I mean, the New York Times has inadvertently on a slogan, all the news is fit to print. They determine what's fit to print.
Oh yeah, they're just stenographers, man. They're just government official story corporate stenographers. And I live in New Hampshire, and I've been involved in the New Hampshire primary here since the year 2000, in one shape or other in different campaigns. And I've met a lot of people from the press, and I got to tell you, a lot of them are not that intelligent nowadays. They really don't know much of anything, and they get, like you said, they get so much wrong. And there's this huge hubris and arrogance, and just condescending nature from a lot of them, especially from the New York Times, and now it's like Daily Beast and Politico, and it's just a gross business. And there's a few journalists I do respect, and who have done great work on the Kennedy case and their own independent research, like Daniel Hopsiker and Whitney Webb. Obviously, your work, and but yeah, for the most part, they're kind of vapid stenographers,
Yeah, that's their role. They think of themselves as a branch of the government, which they kind of are, and they should be. I mean, Finley Peter Dunn, Mr. Dooley, the Irish or Canadian comedy writer, wrote that the job of the media is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And I really believe that. And my job, since I was lied to systematically as a kid, I take this very personally, that I was lied to by the Catholic Church, which I was very involved in. And I was lied to by the media, and I was lied to by the Democratic Party and government, et cetera, et cetera. And so my mission in life has become to expose hidden stories, which I think is part of what journalists should do. And that's one reason why my two Kennedy books I published, Instant Nightmare and Political Truth, independently. One of the liberating things in recent years is self-publication. That used to be frowned on as vanity press, etc. But many, many books are published by self-publishing authors. What you do is you contract with a fulfillment house, which puts the book on demand and mails it out to people. And Amazon lists those books. That was an important step. When people attack Amazon and the internet, I point out some good things about them. The discourse is more free on the internet than it is in the mainstream media. There are a lot of bad sites on the internet, but there are also a lot of honest blogs and publications that kind of escape the official warping of the news. And then mainstream media like to attack them because they're not mediated or not edited. But the problem is a lot of stories, like I tried to give some Bush documents to the New York Times once. I wanted to get them to print. And they said, are you saying that he might have been involved in the Kennedy assassination? And I said, there is some evidence that he could have been. And they said, we'll get back to you. And then they called me 2 days later and they said, we don't want to look at the documents. I just wanted to send them the documents. I was trying to get the story out because the Nation wouldn't run my third story on the case. Bush, on the day of the assassination, he was in Tyler, Texas, which is about 75 miles east of Dallas. He was giving a speech in a club, and he called the FBI in Houston, which is where he lived, and he reported that a worker, he was the head of the Houston Harris County Republican Party at the time he was running for the Senate, and he had a worker named James Parrott, who was a right-wing nut, who was a young guy, and Bush told the FBI Parrott had been threatening to kill the president when it comes to Texas. And first question is, well, if somebody you knew was threatening to kill the president, wouldn't you call the Secret Service before the candidate comes to Texas, not wait till it happens? And so the FBI sent a guy out to find Parrott, and they said he was with his mother at the time, and they kind of dropped the case. And I thought, this is all very strange. So I did a lot of research on Parrott. He wouldn't talk to me. I went to to Houston, and talked to his wife finally, and she said that a couple days ago, the FBI came around and told us not to talk to you. And I said, the FBI? She said, well, or some people like the FBI. They told us not to talk to you. And I thought, wow. I mean, because I kept it a deep secret. I always do this, investigating things. I didn't tell hardly anybody. And I got a strange phone call when I arrived in Houston, very shortly after I arrived. A woman who used to work for the Washington Post who lived in Houston wanted to have me come over to her house. She knew that I was in Houston somehow, and I pretended that I was home in Los Angeles, and she got really angry with me. But she claimed she didn't like Bob Woodward, etc. But one place that knew I was going to, Dallas and Houston, this is right before the election in 1988, to do additional research. I got a grant from a organization gives grants to journalists to study stories because the nation pays almost nothing, and I needed some expense money. And Woodward was on the board of this organization, and I found out the Nation, although it purports to be a liberal publication, has some intelligence connections on their staff as well. So I think somebody there leaked to the FBI or the Republican Party what I was doing. I was aware. I was getting a lot of weird calls from people who were trying to give me disinformation and get me off the track of Bush. But I did a story all based on government documents and other things I found about the Bush-Parrott connection. I turned it into the Nation in late October. I think it was the 24th of October, and they turned it down. They wouldn't run it. And Victor Navasky, the head of the Nation, said, stay away from the Kennedy assassination. It's a quagmire. And the Nation, since the early days, has supported the Warren Report. They did run a couple stories early on questioning the official story, but eventually it said the Warren Report is terrific. So here you have the liberal media.
Oh, yeah.
I.F. Stone was another one. He was this alleged radical journalist. He'd get angry and scream at people. I'm not going to study that horseshit case. So they covered up this. Oh, what I found out was Parrott, even though they claimed he had nothing to do with the assassination, Kennedy was in Houston the day before Dallas. And I went into the Houston papers and I found interesting stories. The police chief said he was terrified all the time Kennedy was in Houston that somebody might shoot him. And so they had some tips. But I also found out the FBI did a 6-month investigation of Parrott and his right-wing friends in Houston and Dallas. He had some crazy friends in Dallas, and I found some of the documents. They did a serious investigation. There was a lot of smoke there, and not clear what the fire was. But a lot of these documents have been removed from the National Archives after Bush became vice president, which I found out was a pattern. I went to the Securities and Exchange Commission because corporations like Bush's Zapata Corporation, oil company, have to file annual reports about what they're doing with the SEC. And I asked for those reports, and they said, oh, they were removed. And I said, when was that? And it was like a month after Bush became vice president, they removed these documents. So they cover their trail. But this whole Parrott story is kind of a loose end. Parrott also went to work for Bush later when he was running for president, which is peculiar. If you think one of your aides might have been involved in threatening or shooting the president, why would you, as a campaign worker? John Hinckley, for example, was a volunteer in George W. Bush's losing campaign for the House in the 70s. And the Bush family were close to the Hinkleys, too. I mean, the Bush family has all these connections, and the nation didn't want to hear about it. And that's an example of this is not exactly mainstream press. This is slightly, off, more liberal press, but they cover up the story too. And it's really the maverick people and people like you, doing podcasts. There are a lot of good podcasts and assassination forums on the internet, which I think are valuable, and blogs and people on the internet exchanging information and writing articles that are good. And we do have freedom of the press in book publishing to some extent. It's hard to get a book published by a mainstream big publisher on the assassination unless you support the official theory.
Yeah.
But you can still get a book published by some of the smaller publishers or self-published, like the Political Truth, recently, and it looks very good. I'm sure it's.
Yeah, that's nice. So that's available on Amazon, and you can order. And Into the Nightmare is still available, correct?
Yeah, that's selling. It keeps selling steadily. People around the world are buying it, and the other book is selling well. And you can do that and get around the system is the way to do it. And so what happened there was the technology. It became easier to put together your own book and make it look professional. You hire a designer and make it look good. And I hired a copy editor to help me, go through it, and then make a deal with the fulfillment house. In my case, a company called Vervante in Utah does a very good job, and they take a cut of the sales, and Amazon takes a cut. But it's all good because Amazon gets it around the world, And so we do have some freedom in the press, even if you don't own a press. I mean, that's almost like owning a press if you make a deal with an independent company like that. But there are many good books on the assassination that keep coming out. That's what I would refer people to. Somebody at Facebook just said, I want to learn more about the case. What do I read? And I told them Accessories After the Fact by Sylvia Marr, Best Evidence by Nick Clifton, Vincent Salandria's False Mystery, Dr. E. Martin Schatz wrote a book called History Will Not Absolve Us. Peter Dale Scott did a book, Deep Politics and the Death of JFK. So there are good books on the case. And
John Newman has some great books and on the case, and of course JFK and the Unspeakable is one of my favorites by James Douglas.
Yeah, those are good. And Douglas Warren's 5-volume set, Newman's books on Oswald and the CIA and Kennedy and Vietnam. Jim DiEugenio.
Oh, he's the gold standard, man. Yeah, DiEugenio's his book reviews are awesome, and that guy just demolishes the official story. And I loved his work with Oliver Stone on those two, Destiny Betrayed and the recent documentaries that came out. I thought those were lights out. So I would recommend anybody interested to check all those books out that Joe mentioned, and please check out Joe's work. It's Into the Nightmare. It is a nightmare, guys. It is a real nightmare, and it's ongoing. And I agree with your thesis that the distrust and everything wrong in our country can be traced back, obviously earlier, but really to November 22nd, 1963, and a blatant daytime coup d'etat and a show of force from the military-industrial complex, which, I know it sounds kind of vague, but that's kind of what I've surmised it to be. And that's why I think it's still important to look into this case and read about it and research it. And, I really appreciate your years of work and research and for paving the way for, other folks like me to come along and look at it. And, a lot of younger people don't really know much about it or don't really think about it. But I still think it's important, and it still matters, to this day. And that's why this month I wanted to do a couple shows about the case. So we are over 2 hours now. I know you mentioned, 2 hour mark, so I want to be respectful of your time. Where can people support your work? And do you have a website or where can people get in touch with you or see all your stuff?
I had several websites. I had a personal one. I had an Into the Nightmare website, but they disappeared. I was so busy. I had 4 books come out between October and March, and I kind of lost track of my website renewals, and those disappeared. There's still one on my memoir, The Broken Places, and there's another one on a book I did called Two Cheers for Hollywood, which is a collection of my short works. But I'm going to have to get websites going again. But you can go on Amazon and find all my books. I've done 24. Most are in print. I'm bringing some back into print that went out of print. But the Political Truth and Into the Nightmare are both on Amazon. That's the place to find them. And I wrote Into the Nightmare for kind of two audiences: specialists who really want to dig more deeply into it, and also for casual readers who are interested in the assassination. It's kind of follows my odyssey as a young man, learning more and more. It's kind of a first-person search account, and people like that approach. And then Political Truth is it's a philosophical book analyzing and critiquing the media. And it really did lead to January 6th because we live in a country in which there are two diametrically opposed views of reality. There's the truth, and then there's this false truth that half the country believes in. It shows it's a dangerous situation. I mean, it's good to be skeptical of the government, but that if it goes too far, it can become very disruptive. And we saw another coup attempt in Washington. But when you shoot the president in broad daylight and don't bother solving the crime, the public gets very disoriented and disenchanted, and so many lies have been put forward. Actually, one thing I've found, and I write about this in Political Truth a lot, that all the major events in our country since 1960, the official story doesn't hold up. The Kennedy assassination, Vietnam, Watergate, Iran-Contra, 9/11, Gulf War, Iraq War, Afghanistan War. The official stories are lies and bullshit. And when you start digging into it, you find out why these things happen. And it is incumbent upon us as citizens to do this and find out. I think that perhaps the single best comment in Kennedy assassination was made by Indira Gandhi, who was Prime Minister of India, and she was assassinated herself. She said Kennedy died because he lost the support of his peers. So here's somebody who really knew governance, and it was an inside job. Kennedy was fired, as somebody put it, by the military-industrial complex because he wouldn't do their bidding and invading Cuba and expanding the war in Vietnam and the belligerent things. And look what's happened to our country since then. We have all the results, fake wars and torture and terrible things that have happened. But we're still kind of trying to recover from that. It's a long haul, and let's hope we can recover. But democracy took a serious blow on November 22nd, 1963, and it may have ended our great experiment of democracy. But maybe we can recover and rebuild it. I don't know. But thank you, Mike, for having me. I really appreciate your time and your interest and your knowledge of the case.
Oh, of course. It was my pleasure. Thank you for your time. And maybe we'll do it again sometime and we can talk more about film, and I can ask you about Orson Welles. That'll be a whole nother thing. But thank you again, Joe. And thank you everybody for watching. We will see you later on this month with another JFK episode. I'm not going to say who it is, but it's a documentary filmmaker who made a recent film about the assassination. So that will be interesting. So stay tuned, folks, and we'll see you.